In this session, we'll be testing wired client access utilizing the policies within our wired policy set and in conjunction with our wired 3K access switch acting as a AAA radius client. Let's review the policy within the wired policy set before we begin testing. And within the wired policy set, we've got an authentication policy to address both MAB and 802.1x authentications, as well as a default for testing from the wired NAT itself. MAB will authenticate against internal endpoints. 802.1x will authenticate against all user ID stores, which will of course include our demo.local join point. We also have an authorization policy global exception in place, allowing our IT staff to have a generic permit access above and beyond standard authorization policy, and that of course would apply to all policy sets as a global exception. And then we have our standard authorization policy, which includes a variety of statements, some that we need to focus on for our current testing. One thing to note is the hierarchy, again, and as a reminder, things will be evaluated from the top down and will be matching the domain computers ahead of contractors or employees, which could be problematic. Once we create a match, we deliver the results, and processing could be exacerbated and problematic as a result of this hierarchy. So let's modify this rule so domain computers is the last one on this list ahead of the default rule, and then save this policy. Then in preparation for testing, we'll modify some settings within the live log. By default, the live log is set up to never refresh automatically. You can manually refresh at any time hitting the refresh button, but let's do something a little more dynamic, and we'll update the refresh timer to every 10 seconds. And notice additional filtering can be applied as well in terms of the latest records and over the latest duration of time. Okay, now let's go ahead and open up a session to our core PC, which is our wired computer within our lab environment and is also a domain member, which will allow us to do the 802.1x authentications. In our initial login here, before testing, we'll log in as the machine local administrator before we log into a domain account to make sure we can modify the NIC settings appropriately for our test here. We'll open up network and sharing settings and look at the adapters available on the core PC. The NIC on the core PC is currently disabled, so we'll enable it. And as we investigate properties here, one thing to point out is that the NIC properties are missing the authentication tab, which is required for 802.1x authentication and modifying the settings related to that. To launch the native Windows 802.1x supplicant for Windows, this is the wired auto config service, and let's check on its current status. And we can see the wired auto config service is not started, currently disabled. And as we open up properties on that, we can see this is the service responsible for performing 802.1x authentications. We'll set that service to automatically start at subsequent reboots, and then we'll start the service. You can see almost right away that we got a warning, informational warning pop up from the NIC itself, and we see that the NIC is attempting to authenticate now that that auto config service is started. Let's review the settings quickly with the NIC itself. And under the authentication tab, we see that we've got it enabled for 802.1x, performing PEEP-based authentication, and that we're validating a server certificate. This would be the ID certificate that our ISE Radius server would be delivering up to perform the first step of authentication, and we'll be validating that server signature with a root CA, which is our Microsoft Domain Controller Certificate Authority. Looking at some additional settings, we also have the Microsoft 802.1x supplicant configured to support either user or computer authentication. This would be effectively an and/or. And we've got the supplicant and NIC property set to remember credentials each time the Windows Core PC is logged into. Okay, now that we've verified the settings, let's go ahead and do a restart and we can evaluate the machine authentication. Go back to the live log and watch the operations continue.